an A. Perfect. So, Jim and Bill, let us know when we're streaming. That's why. Dude, that must be it.
They should be at the Lowell. Everyone should be at the Lowell Folk Festival. Starts at noon. I could go right after this, which I might go back. Depends which way the light lets me go. When I get to the first intersection, I'll go left or right or straight.
That's very. That would be Townsend, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. No, just the girl. No, just the girl.
Just.
Yeah. Okay. We're about to start. She's motivated.
Good morning, everyone. Hi.
Hey, Franz. See you later.
All of you are lucky to be here early. I'm Satyagat Khalsa. I'm on the Lyceum Committee, and I'm the host for today's program, which is Somebody Should Do Something. And that's what we're here doing. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the Grove Street Band. They're Chaz Boulieu, Eric Blackmer, and Lisa Murray. David Duhan is normally part of this group, but he can't be with us today. They will play for us this morning selections from a recent CD called Harp Unstrung, a tribute to Turlough O'Carolan, the 18th century Irish composer. Welcome, Grove Street Band.
You might be wondering, these beads are my souvenir from the going to the Lowell Folk Festival yesterday, which you guys should all be there this afternoon. It's all afternoon in Lowell. It's only 40 miles from here.
And you can't believe anything you hear about Lowell. It's a really nice place, actually. Bridget Cruz is the next tune we're doing. Okay, just so you know, Turlock O'Carolan was a blind itinerant Irish harpist, born in the late 1600s and lived until 1738. He wrote many songs. This is Mrs. Judge. This is our political song.
It's called Rights of Man. Collect them while supplies last, please do. Good thing Lisa's here.
If you want something done right, have a woman do it.
That last song was not by Turlough O'Carroll, that was from my good buddy Tom Fabonio, who lives in Rockport. He's still with us. He's still a living, it's the only living composer I think we actually play. And he is still living. I called his wife up last night and talked to her, and she confirmed that he was still alive. More or less, you know. Arthur Shane?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Okay, he's not going to do it. This is a song by Bob McQuillan, who's a local, very amazing man.
Oh, yeah, Loftus. Let's do a quick version of Loftus. Back to Carolyn. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce our moderator, I want to acknowledge our seasoned sponsor, Microspec, the sponsor of this talk, Bellitates, and Rosalie's Garden for the Flowers. And we're also grateful for our community sponsors, Roy's Market, Bluefinch Partners, Sweet Macron, Cranberry Meadow Farms, Toadstool Books, Peterborough Players, and the 1833 Society. We're grateful for all our contributors, large and small, all our attendees here and on YouTube. And as if you were here last week, Mary Beth Callahan said, it takes a village, so thanks to all of you. So there's an insert in today's program that says we have a replacement moderator, Dr. Lundy Lewis. Read his bio. It's on the insert, and you'll see he's not a second-string moderator. He's a talented and accomplished gentleman. It's more like the star who comes off the bench to hit a home run to win the game. We will have one philosophy professor posing questions to another philosophy professor, and that will be very interesting. So please welcome Dr. Lundy Lewis.
Thank you, Seth, for that nice introduction. Good morning. I am Lundy Lewis, the moderator for today. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, Dr. Michael Brownstein. May we call you Michael? Okay, Michael. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought outstanding world-class speakers to the Monadnock region to serve as catalysts to inform and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. Most of you who've been coming to this know that. Now, let me tell you that both today's talk and the past talks are available as podcasts and videos at the website monadnocklyceum.org. No spaces, no hyphens, and spell it as it sounds. Following Michael's presentation today, he'll answer questions from the audience. So, as he speaks, if a question comes to mind, jot it down on this yellow card. that's on your pew, and a usher will come around to pick it up. For those watching virtually, please submit your questions by using the live chat section on YouTube. Let us say that the Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported entirely through donations and contributions from the audience and community members. We do appreciate your donations, and if you want to make a donation, you can place it in the water bowl here in this area. I think it's over there maybe, or one that's back in the parish hall immediately behind us. They're not water bowls, they're glass bowls. I misread that. Those listening at home may make contributions at our website or by mail. Thank you again for the generous support. Also, we encourage generally feedback on the Lyceum Speakers Series. And if you have any comments or feedback or want to get on the mailing list, there's a green card for that. So jot that down and put that in the glass bowl as well. After Michael speaks, we'll have an informal reception with snacks and such in the parish hall, again, directly behind me through this door, my right, your left. Hope to see you there. So now for the speaker. Our speaker is Michael Brownstein, a philosophy professor and chair of the philosophy department at CUNY, City University of New York in Brooklyn. And he spent a lot of time thinking about questions I'm sure most of us have entertained to ourselves privately or publicly, namely, the world is a mess. And what can I do to make it better? And that's the sort of thing that the philosopher Michael has been thinking about, published a book with two co-authors entitled, Somebody Should Do Something. How anyone can help create social change. So the book takes up those questions directly. The book explores how our personal choices connect to the larger structural change. And I'm reminded of the adage we've been hearing for decades, think globally, act locally. And he'll talk about why those choices do matter, though perhaps not in the way we usually assume. Michael considers problems like climate change, racism, and poverty, and we know that those sometimes feel too big for any one of us to touch. But he's going to tell us how to do it. Michael and his co-authors make the case that the roles we already hold in our lives, for example, as neighbors, colleagues, family members, parents, voters, even people we pass on the street casually, carry more influence than we tend to recognize once we understand how to use them. So that question, how ordinary people can shape the issues around them, is very much at the heart of why this Lyceum exists also. So Michael is on the same page as the Lyceum in its mission, and that is to inform and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. With that, then, please join me in welcoming Michael Brownstein.
Thank you. It's an enormous honor and privilege to be here with all of you today. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. So I'm going to show you some slides. If you can't read the text, if it's too far away, I'll read the important bits. I want to acknowledge Okay, we move forward. I want to acknowledge that the work I'm going to talk about is collaborative with two friends of mine, Alex Madva and Dan Kelly. Obviously, they're not here today, so if I say anything that sounds wrong or stupid, just blame them. So I want to begin by telling a little story. It's a story about what was happening in the United States, particularly in cities in the 1920s, when automobiles were on the rise. So there were more and more cars in cities, and as a result of that, there were more and more accidents, and in particular, more and more pedestrian accidents where people were getting hit by cars. And one reason for that was because, as you probably know, in cities, a lot of living happened in the streets before the rise of automobiles. People would stop and chat in the middle of streets, kids would be playing in the middle of streets, and so on. But as there were more and more cars, there was a conflict brewing about who the streets belonged to, people or cars. Some cities tried to deal with this problem by enacting laws and policies to try to make the streets safer. So in Cincinnati, for instance, in 1924, there was a referendum to force automobile companies to install what they called governors in cars that would prohibit them from going more than 25 miles an hour. More than 10% of the city signed on for the initiative. It came up for a vote. A bunch of car companies, maybe you would be unsurprised to learn, rallied against the initiative, and it ultimately failed. But what the car companies realized was that it wasn't going to work to fight these sort of proposals one by one across the country. What they really wanted to do and needed to do was change the conversation. They needed to change the culture around the streets and who belonged in them. And what they came up with was a strategy to put the problem on individuals' shoulders. One person you may recognize the name of, John Hertz, who founded the car rental company Hertz, said the following: "We are living in a motor age, and we must have not only motor age education, but a motor age sense of responsibility. The streets are for vehicle traffic, the sidewalks are for pedestrians." He actually came up, he and his associates, who had formed the American Automobile Association, came up with a new term, a neologism, to denigrate people who don't know how to walk safely in the city, in order to sort of inculcate this idea that it's each of our responsibility to know how to stay out of accidents. Anyone want to guess what that term was? A jaywalker, that's exactly right. So it was a portmanteau of jay, which was an insult. It was to be a country bumpkin, and a walker, someone who's walking around the city. So a jaywalker was somebody who didn't know how to walk safely around the city. So telling us something about his political sensibilities, Hertz said, "We fear the jaywalker worse than the anarchist." Incidentally, he and his associates also did a contest to try to come up with another term after this one was popular for irresponsible drivers, because they realized, of course, it couldn't just be people walking on the streets that needed individual responsibility. It was drivers as well. You probably have not heard the winning term. It did not stick around with us. It is a flivver boob. The master stroke that Hertz and his colleagues came up with is one that didn't go away, and it's one that you probably recognize from some of these ad campaigns and slogans. So Smokey the Bear telling people that each of us can prevent forest fires. Alcohol companies saying, "Drink responsibly." Wayne LaPierre from the NRA saying that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Maybe the most famous illustration of this concept of putting it on each of our individual shoulders to solve complex societal problems is on the top of the screen there, which some of you may recognize. It's an image from probably the most famous public service announcement of all time. It's colloquially referred to as the Crying Indian ad. It debuted on Earth Day in 1971, and it was ostensibly an anti-littering campaign. You may remember it. You can look it up on YouTube. It shows this man who's went by the name Iron Eyes Cody. He was a famous actor, paddling a traditional-looking canoe down a pristine river. But soon you realize the river is not so pristine, and there's garbage floating in it, and he pulls the canoe up onto the shore. And you soon realize he's next to a highway, and someone speeding by rolls their window down and throws a bag of garbage out, and it lands at his feet. Iron Eyes Cody turns to the camera with a tear rolling down his cheek, and the ominous-sounding narrator says, "Some people have a deep and abiding respect for what once was this land. Some people don't. People start pollution, and people can stop it." The public service announcement was widely acclaimed for being quite effective for reducing roadside litter, for really trying to help inculcate an attitude that you shouldn't just throw your trash on the side of the road. But in many ways, the ad was a fraud. And there's one way in which some people are familiar, which is that Iron Eyes Cody, who lived his whole life as a Native American, was in fact a Sicilian American. His real name was Aspera Oscar de Corti, but he told everyone his parents were Cherokee and Cree. He went around giving talks to Native American communities, admonishing them about gambling and alcohol, and it only really came out after his death that it was all pretend. But actually, the bigger fraud was that you probably can't see in the teeny little font. It says that the PSA was sponsored by a group called Keep America Beautiful. Keep America Beautiful was created by executives of disposable canned and bottling companies. And what they were doing was exactly what the automobile companies were doing decades before. So in the 1950s and 1960s, when America's litter and pollution problem was sort of dawning on our consciousness, they saw the writing on the wall. Some states were starting to pass laws prohibiting the use of disposable containers. So for instance, Vermont in 1954 banned the sale of beer in single-use containers. So that was bad for their bottom line, and what they did was exactly what the car companies did. They changed the conversation, right, away from solving this problem through laws or policy or changing systems and putting it on individuals' shoulders to be responsible for their own conduct. The most contemporary example of this long history, which I'm about to wrap up, comes from the climate change space. You've probably heard of the concept of your personal carbon footprint, right? The idea that what you can do if you care about climate change is reduce your personal consumption or the things that you do that lead to the release of greenhouse gases. You may also know, or maybe not, that the concept of the personal carbon footprint was popularized by the oil company BP in the early 2000s. This is one of the original print ads that they created. And they were using that exact same playbook, right? What they didn't want was a binding international treaty or a federal carbon tax that would hurt their bottom line. It didn't hurt them at all to sort of tell all of us it's your problem, right? Each of you needs to be the solution by doing whatever little things you can to mind your personal carbon footprints. So there's something very troubling about this narrative, right? Because what it does is keeps most all of the problems in place and gives us the feeling like we're doing something to create a better world, but not really, right? This silly little cartoon from The Onion captures something about what's wrong about this story, right? So if you can't see the type, it says, "Woman separates yogurt cups into cardboard and plastic as 95 private jets land in Venice for Jeff Bezos' wedding," right? The idea being that what she's fastidiously doing in her house is just on an incomprehensibly scale, orders of magnitude, inconsequential compared to all these super rich people flying their jets to go to this other super rich person's wedding. There has been, given this kind of intuition that there's something off about this individualizing or responsibilizing history, a pushback against it. And you may recognize it from various parts of media or literature. Let's go forward. Okay, so here are some headlines from magazines that maybe sound familiar to you. The top one is from Vox, and it reads, "I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle. Stop obsessing over your environmental sins. Fight the oil and gas industry instead." The bottom one, written by Michael Mann, an influential climate scientist, says, "You can't save the climate by going vegan. Corporate polluters must be held accountable." Right, so these are both people pushing back against this idea that what we need to do to solve a complex global problem like climate change is just be better individual stewards of our own backyards, right? And we actually need to challenge power, challenge the complexity of the problem at its source instead. This pushback is also found in the scholarly literature. So Nick Chater and George Lowenstein are two behavioral scientists who wrote a very influential article and then followed up with a book titled "It's on You," tracking the history that I just told you about putting complex social problems on the shoulders of individuals in much more detail than I just talked about. And they cover a range of topics from the ones I said, but including also ideas about financial literacy, about diet culture, about all kinds of things. So this is the conversation that my collaborators and I, in our research over the last 10 years or so, have wanted to intervene on, this tension or this conflict between making change at the individual level, assuming some sense of responsibility for it, or making change at the social or the society level. Or just to put that more briefly, changing systems or changing individuals. So we wrote a series of articles in various journals, and then most recently this book, Somebody Should Do Something. And I'm going to try to describe some of the bigger ideas that came out of this research project. The main target of our critique is that there is really a choice to be made here between changing systems or changing individuals. So on the board here, I have a quote from two really terrific social psychologists, but who I think get it wrong, in this quote at least, when they say, "Solutions need to focus on structuring the social context rather than changing the beliefs or values of individuals." So these folks represent the pushback against this long history of individualizing problems, and they want to swing the pendulum the other way entirely, right? And they're saying, don't worry about recycling or minding your personal carbon footprint or whatever the individual version is for the problem you're worried about. Just change the system, change the structures, change the economy or the laws, and that's where the real sort of oomph comes from. That's where the money is. Rather than makes it seem as if we have like an either-or choice. And just to make that more concrete, I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean by the either-or choice. So if your focus is on climate change, right, you might think that, well, you could focus on your own personal carbon footprint, or you could demand a federal or a global carbon tax, right, that puts a tax on carbon emissions and solves the problem at its source. Either or. If you're interested in the problem, the epidemic of type 2 diabetes in our country, right, you might think that, well, the solution is to teach people about healthy eating, to make better and healthier personal choices. Or on the other side, you might recognize that poverty is one of the strongest predictors of type 2 diabetes and say, we have to attack the source of the problem and eliminate poverty instead, right? And so this graph here is about different government policies that reduce poverty. Or if you're interested in political misinformation, maybe you think, well, one option is I need to learn to be a good reader of the internet, right? I need to teach digital literacy to myself or to my students or to my family. Or you might think, no, what we need to do is regulate social media companies. Each of these presents an either-or choice. And what I'm going to do is give you a few reasons to think that there's a problem with seeing it that way. So 3 arguments against either-or thinking about social change. And the first is just that when you start looking at any one example and thinking about it in detail, the distinction between the options becomes blurry. So the first problem is a problem of vagueness. And I'll fully admit this is like a philosopher's problem. So I cop to thinking this is the kind of one I might care about, but maybe you don't. So for instance, if you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the Biden-era signature climate policy at the time, the most important climate legislation this country has ever passed. Is that a structuralist sort of solution because it's a massive federal policy? Or is it an individualist sort of approach because it encouraged people to reduce their personal carbon footprints, right? One of the major things the IRA did was try to make electric cars and heat pumps and so on cheaper for people, right? And that's fundamentally a way of each of us being associated with less carbon emissions. Or suppose you decide to volunteer for a Get Out the Vote campaign, right? You get together with friends and you call people in swing states to try to convince them to vote the way you believe they ought to. Is that a structuralist endeavor because it's aiming for collective action? You and your community have gotten together to do this work? Or is it individualist because it aims to persuade people one by one about how they ought to vote, right? You're trying to challenge or persuade them to think differently. Last example, as a sort of scholar, maybe what you want to know is what leads people to put solar panels on the roof of their house, right? Pretty important question. As I'm going to come back to later, an interesting predictor of what leads people to put panels on their roof is if their neighbors have panels on their roof. So suppose you do research on that. That's called peer influence on solar diffusion. Well, is that research sort of in a structural system-changing vein because it's focused on changing the social environment within which people make their choices? Or is it individual because it's targeting people in virtue of being consumers? So for each of these examples, I want to say you can see it either way depending on what you're bringing to the conversation. It's a little bit like the famous duck-rabbit illusion, which maybe you've seen before. It's one of the most famous visual illusions, goes back to the 19th century. And the point is, you can see it as a duck or you can see it as a rabbit. I always see it as a duck first and then have to sort of struggle to see it as a rabbit, but maybe for some of you it's the other way around. And the point I want to make about this is that if someone asked you, okay, but like really at the end of the day, is it a duck or is it a rabbit, right? That would be a nonsensical question, right? At the end of the day, it's a duck rabbit, right? It's both. It matters how you see it. And I want to suggest that that's the way we should think about making social change at the individual level or at the level of systems and structures. It's always both, and it's a matter of what you're paying attention to. Now, the second problem with either-or thinking is that I've sort of set up the conversation, it's not just me, this is the way the discourse typically goes, to suggest that changing systems and structures and laws and treaties, all the structural stuff, is like where the real action is, right? That's where you really get the bang for your buck. But it's not as if changing systems and structures at that level is bound to work. And when you look at the history of endeavors to create structural change, to change the laws, to change governments, what you see is a history of mostly backfire, unintended consequences, and all kinds of difficulties that make structural change really difficult. So if I'd ask you to imagine right now, like, what is the fantasy version of structural change in the United States, what some people might think of is amending the Constitution, right? That's like virtually unthinkable in our current political environment, right? But it's not as if we haven't done it before, and it's not as if we haven't undone it before, as the Prohibition example shows, right? And one lens through which to think of why Prohibition failed is because mostly nobody liked it, right? People's hearts and minds weren't behind it. And you could think of that as saying that the individual side of the coin, right? People weren't persuaded to think that that change was worthwhile. And our history has so many examples like that. So if you think about the civil rights movement, right, and think about the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, it's not as if that landmark Supreme Court decision, as crucial as it was, immediately solved all the problems, right? We are still fighting the battle for school integration and so much else. Right? And that is a matter of people's hearts and minds needing persuasion just as much as the laws and institutions needing to be changed. It's the same in the current debates around climate change and where we ought to put our emphasis. Carbon taxes, just because I've mentioned that as an example a few times already, have almost everywhere in the world failed. They've either failed to be implemented, or where they've been implemented, they've created backlash and been taken away. And a simple version of why that is because they're taxes, and nobody likes taxes. But the point is, while it's a kind of economist's dream, right? It's the most efficient sort of solution, it's not the one that people typically like, and it's not the one that people are persuaded to get behind. And that's as essential a part of the story as anything else. Now, the third problem with either-or thinking is that I think it puts us in a kind of motivational dilemma. So I want to go back to this woman who I sort of teased before for fastidiously sorting the yogurt cups or whatever, and I want to give her some love, right? She's doing what she can. She's doing what she can think of, right? What does she have to do with Jeff Bezos' wedding? She can't control those 95 private jets that are spewing carbon emission across the ocean, right? But what she can do is recycle well, right? And so I think she's caught in a kind of dilemma of seeing the world in the following way. The things I can do might not really have a big impact, but that's what I know how to do. Whereas the things I'm told really matter, the global carbon taxes or an international treaty, are completely far from my mind, right? I don't know anything about how to create a global international treaty or how to take down the fossil fuel industry, right? That's so far from myself, from my daily life, from what I know or believe or feel some control over. And that's a really bad position to leave us all in, right? If the message is the things that matter you can't control, and the things you can control don't really matter. So we need some different ways to think about change. And so that's sort of what our book is about. It's about tools for thinking differently, about making an impact. And the way I'll frame that here is in terms of 6 ways to be both and rather than either or about social change. I'm not going to give you, it's not a listicle, it's not like a top 10 list of here's your tasks. It's new ways to think about finding your role in changing unjust systems in the world. The way I'll present them is as skills, things we can practice. You might think of them as virtues, and in some of our work we've referred to the sort of broad category as structure-facing virtues, ways we can learn to be good structure changers. The definition we give, if you want to be particular, is as dispositions to notice and act upon situational influences on our minds. So I'll introduce the first of these virtues with another brief story. Up on the screen is Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, You may recognize her name. Her son was Fela Kuti, famous Afrobeat musician. But in her day, she was much more famous than her son. She was probably the most famous activist in colonial Nigeria. But she didn't start off that way. She started off that way as sort of a do-gooder, someone who wanted to help improve people's lives in her neighborhood. And she started off in 1932 by starting the Abeokuta Ladies Club. And what they taught was etiquette, manners, they taught literacy in the community. But the whole sort of orientation was, how can I get the person in my neighborhood to make their life a little bit better? But Kuti was an observant person, and over time, she came to be more and more familiar with the really horrible injustices of the colonial system in Nigeria. She got radicalized, is one way to put it. And what she came to see was the bigger problems were the colonial system itself and suffrage. Right? So women didn't have the right to vote. And so she ultimately changed the Abeokuta Ladies Club into the Abeokuta Women's Union and became an organizer around Nigerian independence and women's suffrage, both of which they were instrumental in achieving. Independence in 1960, women's suffrage, incredibly, not until 1979, a year after she was tragically killed. She was actually thrown out of the window of her home by the government troops. If you're a fan of podcasts, I'll say, Jad Abumrad from Radiolab, maybe some of you have heard of him, he recently did a series about Fela Kuti, and there's one episode in there entirely about Funmilayo, and it's terrific, so I recommend it in case anyone wants to learn more about her. So in the book, we tell her story, and we tell her story as a story of coming to see structures, to see systems of inequality as structuring the choices or the possibilities for freedom for any individual. And so that's really the first crucial structure-facing virtue that I want to emphasize, is just knowing that all of our decisions and our options and our possibilities for movement in life are incentivized, are sometimes blocked, are made possible by the broader societal forces that we live within. If you're here today, I'm thinking this is not news to you, but I think it's important to articulate. And I don't think we have to become full-time revolutionaries who are willing to risk our lives to see structures and act on them. So I'll just sort of give you a much more banal example. Suppose you're interested in bicycle commuting, right, as a form of making your community better, as a form of acting on climate concerns that you may have. Bike lanes are great, right? They reduce pollution, they get people exercise. But if you live in a city that doesn't have good bicycle infrastructure yet, you're kind of caught in a bind, right? Because you don't want to be saying to people, you should ride your bike, if riding your bike feels like taking your life into your hands every time you get on it because there's not safe places to ride, right? So that sort of makes individual action a little bit tricky in this case, right? Because you don't want to go riding your bike necessarily or persuading other people to ride their bike. And so what you might do is swing all the way the other way and say, well, we need better bike infrastructure. We need to change that system. And now you feel a little stuck, right? Because you're not going to ride your bike until the system changes, but how do you get the system to change if enough people aren't riding their bikes, et cetera? So I think a both-and alternative that's based on seeing the systems we need is to teach people how safe cycling requires better infrastructure and how to petition our local city governments to create it. So the idea here, this is sort of the trick, is not to abandon the idea of making personal choices to try to make the world better, not to abandon the idea of taking personal responsibility for whatever the problems are we're concerned with, right? That's that structuralist move I want to resist. But to redirect it, to redirect our sense of which personal decisions are the most important ones and which personal decisions enact our responsibility. Okay, I'm going to go a little more quickly now. I might be slightly more than 5 minutes. That's okay. It's not enough, though, to just see structures. We need to understand them, right? We need to have the correct understanding of which ones need changing. And to illustrate this, I want to turn briefly to developmental psychology. Little kids are like sponges for social status, right? And this famous photograph from Richard Sandler, I think, brings it home nicely. So if you can't see, it's a picture of all little white kids and black nannies, right? And what those kids are learning is something about the status hierarchies in their society. And developmental psychologists have made this very clear that kids pick this up from a very early age. They pick up on accent, they pick up on language spoken, they pick up on ethnicity, they pick up on gender, right? And they're learning about our hierarchies from these observations. But the key point is that not all kids end up with the same understanding of those regularities. Some kids grow up to question them, and some kids grow up to essentialize them, right? To think that's the natural order of things. And so this provides an opportunity for all of us to be agents of social change in virtue of being parents, right? Because the literature shows that parents are the ones who affect their kids' attitudes towards status hierarchies. So parents' comfort, as an example, with existing social hierarchies predicts their kids' prejudices, their preferences for diverse classrooms, and their charitableness to people in other groups than their own. It's not enough, though, still to see social structures and to understand them, but to also see them as changeable, right? If you think that everything is fated to be the way it is, then you're not going to make any change. You may have heard of the concept of a growth mindset. If you teach in a school or ever go into an elementary school, you probably see posters about growth mindsets everywhere. The idea is to teach kids that valuable traits like intelligence are learnable. They're not something you're just born with or you're not. The trouble is that there's been a lot of criticism of growth mindsets as a way of improving education, because the worry is it's just focused on individual kids, and it leaves the system as it is, right? So if some school districts are much better funded than others, you might think, what's growth mindset literature going to do about that, right? It's presuming that's never going to change, and it's just fiddling around at the margins with kids. But I think there's a response to this, one version of which is that teachers, and again, I'm going to come back to different social roles each of us might occupy, teachers can be that social atmosphere for kids that makes growth mindsets stick. And so there's really interesting research suggesting that when teachers have a growth mindset, their kids learn it. But it's also the case that we can adopt growth mindsets towards institutions themselves, which is the belief that institutions and hierarchies can be changed. This is a version of what some researchers call counterfactual thinking, the way of understanding how things could be different. The writer Isabel Wilkerson really sort of captures the importance of this in this wonderful passage I'll read to you. She says, "On those cotton fields were opera singers, jazz musicians, playwrights, novelists, surgeons, attorneys, accountants, professors, journalists. We know that because that is what they and their children and now their grandchildren and even great-grandchildren have often chosen to become once they had the chance to choose for themselves." Okay, so far I've talked about seeing social structures, understanding them, and seeing them as changeable, but of course we also have to have the willingness to go out and change them, right? To see the status quo as something we can do something about. This requires overcoming a kind of disposition that human beings naturally have, which you might refer to as status quo bias, or as the psychologist John Jost calls it, system justification theory, which is a tendency we have to think that the way things are must be just because that's the way they are. But again, not all people are as susceptible to it as everyone else. And so in our research, what we did is we went out and we tried to look at examples of people who fight against unjust status quos in the riskiest of situations. And so one body of literature comes from research around the 2010s in the Arab Spring. The psychologist Aaron Ayanian went and interviewed a bunch of protesters who really risked their lives in ways that, for the most part, thank goodness in this country we do not have to do yet, at least, and tried to figure out what led them to go out in the streets, right, in these genuinely high-risk situations. And what she found was really eye-opening. Some things were unsurprising, like if people were personally threatened, they were more likely to join a protest. But the thing that was surprising was that they did not believe, more than your average person, that they were going to change the world. They didn't believe they were going to overthrow the regime. They didn't necessarily even think that was likely. But what they had unusually strong beliefs in was their capacity to make a difference to the other people who were there at the protest. They would say things like, if I show up, I might help keep my neighbor safe. If I go, I might get my sister's kid home safely, etc., right? They were tied toward one another. And this is mirrored in other bodies of literature. So there's a very famous political science paper looking at the Mississippi Freedom Riders and comparing the people who signed up to go on the freedom rides to the people who signed up but didn't show up. And what Doug McAdam found was that the people who signed up and went had far more community ties to other people in the movement. They were part of organizations, they had more friendships, more solidarity, in other words, with their community, right? So the point is that they didn't necessarily believe, I all by myself am going to change the world, but they believed they could make a difference to the other people in their community. I think we saw an example of this very recently this past year in Minnesota in the protests against ICE, where it was a real explosion of mutual aid networks that enabled people to feel safe and go out and make a difference. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all great, but like, suppose all the people in this room go out and embody these virtues. We're still a pretty small group, right? So like, how do you spread any of this? How do you grow the group? And I want to make an argument that it's really valuable to communicate our values and our virtues, even if it comes at the risk of virtue signaling, which is sort of got a bad rap these days, right? So this is this picture of the Democratic leadership during the Black Lives Matter movement, kneeling in kente cloth in the rotunda, and it was sort of widely panned for seeming inauthentic. But I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater for our interest in communicating our values and our virtues. And I'm going to turn real briefly back to developmental psychology to make this case. So this still image here is from a study, there's many of them like this, that are on what's called over-imitation. And I encourage you to watch a video of it because it's adorable. So imagine I've got like a little box here and it's transparent and there's like a toy inside and I've got a little kid, like a 3-year-old with me, and I'm showing the kid how to get to the toy. And so there's a series of steps. I take a rod out of the side, but what I do without telling the kid is I add some unnecessary steps. So I take the rod out, I tap the top, I twirl the rod, and then eventually I insert it and a window pops open and then I get the toy out and I say, now you do it. And the question is, does the kid copy all of the steps or just the ones that make a difference? The over-imitation paradigm is based on the idea that almost all human children copy all the steps, right? They do everything that you did, even the silly little twirling of the stick, etc. If you do the same experiment with chimpanzees, they just cut right to the chase, right? They don't care at all about the needless steps. And you can do it with all kinds of other animals. It's really interesting with elephants and dolphins and dogs. None of them care about the extra steps. And what developmental psychologists infer from this is that human beings are far more deeply social learners than any other creatures. Most creatures learn about the world by looking out and observing. We look at each other. Right? And our way of talking about this in the book is that we are truly outside-in creatures. We imbibe and absorb what's outside of us far more than any other animals that we know about. And that can be a lesson for how to make change. So the great economist Bob Frank has this book about putting peer pressure to work, and I'll just use his example really quickly. It starts with smoking. So Frank asks the question, why is secondhand smoking dangerous? And what first might come to mind is that, well, if you're in a restaurant and there's someone else smoking, it's going to get in your lungs and it's going to make you sick. But his argument is that the real danger of secondhand smoking is that it's public, and public smoking makes more smokers. It makes smoking seem normal and natural and acceptable. And then he turns that on its head and says, well, we can use that for good, right? We can inculcate norms against smoking, and he has all this fascinating data showing that behavior is contagious. People quit when their sibling quits, when close friends quit, when their spouse quits. And this is not just true of smoking, it's true of all kinds of other things. Right? If your kid goes to college and their randomly assigned dorm roommate is a voter, they will become a voter, right? On the same order of magnitude as if their parents were voters. It's a huge effect. This is that example of peer influence on solar that I was talking about before, right? And this is why it's relevant here, because the reason people put panels on their roof is often because they see them around and they think, okay, that's something I should consider doing, right? That's being an outside-in creature. So one lesson here is not just to think about our choices, our personal choices, in their material terms, not just how many pounds of greenhouse gases can I save if I bike to work or put panels on the roof or whatever, but social influence. Who can I influence with my choices and by making those choices public? I know I'm a little over on time. I'm almost there. This is the last point, that all of these lessons are going to be indexed to who we are as particular people with different social roles. And so the summary here is, right, if we're going to learn how laws and institutions and systems affect us, then we have to identify skills-based approaches to changing collective practices, and we do that by finding roles each of us can play. So I talked about the role that Funmilayo Kuti found. In our book, we talk about lots of other characters, some of which their politics we very vehemently disagree with. So in the white is Harlan Carter. He was the legislative genius behind the NRA's rise to power. And what he really spearheaded was the creation of social identity around gun ownership, which is a crucial lever for change. We talk about Janice Leitner, who founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and really embodied the role of a single-issue crusader. Her daughter was tragically killed by a drunk driver. Within 20 years, her organization was known by 94% of Americans, and she was instrumental in getting national laws changed. We talk about union organizers. In Staten Island, the first Amazon warehouse to be organized was done by a sort of ragtag group of labor organizers who emphasized just the importance of being there every day, getting to know their colleagues, and talking to them about the value of the union. All of us have all kinds of social roles, right? And if I can leave you with just one thought, it's to find yours, right? And think about it as an opportunity for changing unjust systems, unjust institutions, unjust structures. And so I will conclude there and just say thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for a lovely talk, thought-provoking, brings all sorts of ideas to mind. So this is the point at which we're collecting questions from the audience, both here and online. So one philosopher to another, I'll ask a question while we're doing that. And we didn't go over this earlier. We talked about possible questions, but this question came to mind as you were speaking. And so I mentioned in your introduction the adage, think globally, act locally, that we've been living with. You said as bumper stickers, but I realized by your talk that's not quite right. So how would you change that little slogan so that it's more on the mark and effective?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for not giving this question.
No, that's fine. It's a great question. I don't have a problem with think globally, act locally. I think in some ways it does capture the spirit. I suppose my version of it would be think structurally, act individually, right? Which is to say, I think each of us does have a personal responsibility to try to make the world a more just and better place. But doing that is not necessarily a way of trapping yourself into playing small ball and just sorting the yogurt cups, right? Individual action can still be turned toward systems of injustice and inequality that are local, national, and international. And so that's the sort of way I want to focus us.
Okay. Maybe more on this at lunch between this. But we got some nice questions here, a bunch of questions. The first one is good. Was there a moment when a light bulb went off for you that made you want to follow this line of research?
So the sort of personal biography is that I was doing research for many years on bias and prejudice. And I was informed by a lot of psychological research on how people learn about racial categories, how people learn about gender categories, and then how it affects their behavior, sometimes even without their awareness or their intention. And then I was interested in how to change those sort of biases and prejudices that we've kind of absorbed from the world around us. And not just me, a lot of people were interested in that research and writing about it. And we kept getting a certain criticism. And that criticism was that all of that work was too individualistic. It was treating race and prejudice as if they're individual problems that are just sort of problems in our own individual minds. And that it ignores broader systems of inequality, structural forms of injustice, racial hierarchies that are built into the economy, that are built into history, and so on. And so I and collaborators of mine had to kind of think about what that criticism meant for our work because we took it very seriously. And this work came out of that, first focused on racism specifically, but then we kind of realized, you know what, this is a discourse or a debate that's happening all over the place. And so when I got interested in climate change and climate politics, I saw exactly the same sort of dead-end debate going on. Is it individuals? Is it the system? And thought, you know what, we've got some tools here to get over that kind of dead-end debate, not just about racism, not just about climate change, but sort of about anything, whether it's political misinformation or diabetes or income inequality or anything. And so that's kind of what gave rise to the broad brushstrokes sort of book that we wrote.
Okay, these questions show the intelligence of the audience. They're really abstract and hard to get across, some of them, but here's an easy one. So let's go with that. And I'll remind the audience that we can have personal discussions all afternoon, even though I know you're going back to New York sometime. But in these messy political times, what gives you hope?
This is supposed to be an easy question?
Easy to read.
Yeah. I'll say two things. One is that I think, by and large, I say this at some risk of fair criticism, everyone is trying to do what they think is right and like trying to make the world a better place. Even people whose politics and goals are just totally different from mine, I do think they think they're trying to make the world a better place. And that doesn't mean I have any sympathy toward their ends, but I think it's, for me at least, reframes what otherwise sometimes feels a more combative place that I end up in, which is just like, you know, people who want to let fossil fuel companies run rampant or whatever just have nothing to say, right? I can't get into their mindset at all. And so it helps me a little bit, and maybe it's a form of hope, to think like, well, they want to make the world a better place, but maybe have a different set of information or have been taught a different set of values about how to do that. I think the second thing I would say is that I've come away from doing this research on the history and the social science of creating change far more humbled about our ability to predict the future than I was coming into it. We have very little clue, despite, you know, in some ways what I just said, like what leads to what. And you might think of that as kind of a despairing thought because you're going to work really hard at what you care most about, and if you don't know it's going to work out, like, why do it? But to me, there's a hopeful version of that, which is that, like, you never know if momentous change is right around the corner. It could be that this thing you've been working at that feels unrewarding or tireless or endless is like the thing right before the dawn or whatever. And so to me, that's a hope, that the sort of humility we ought to have in our ability to predict the future is a source of hope.
Okay, thank you. And I've got some other ones. What is the role of an artist, and what is their responsibility to bring about the sorts of social change that you've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm so unqualified to answer it as not an artist myself. But I mean, one easy answer is that I think it's clear that what moves people on an emotional level are stories, are images, are narratives, is music, is all the things we might want to call art, right? It's not philosophical arguments. It's not logical entailments of beliefs that we hold antecedently or anything like that. And so, of course, one crucial role for artists is to play the role of selling the ideas that other people playing different roles are articulating. And so the image that pops to my mind is in the lead up to the fight over the Inflation Reduction Act, when it was called the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office created these posters for the Green New Deal that were reminiscent of the old New Deal posters. And they were about wind farms, and they were about heat pumps, and they took these very banal parts of our lives and made them beautiful. And for me, I found them very moving, and I think there could be that times a million out there. I think someone else could probably come up with a better answer, but that's what I got.
That's good. Here's a good one, sort of like fill in the blank. Talk to us. Help us develop strategies to affect our country's fill in the blank, but this person says healthcare system.
Okay.
These are hard, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely not an expert on healthcare or the activism required around healthcare specifically, so I'm not sure I can say anything helpful there. But I suppose I think that it's an instance of a problem that hits many people on their day-to-day life, like the discussion going on now amongst democratic politics about affordability. And here's maybe another role for artists to think creatively about how to put the issue succinctly and in ways that we all understand, that put it front and center. And maybe this is a little too much like tooting my own horn, but that connect the way in which the day-to-day lived experience of what it's like not to have good health care is a part of a broader system of injustice, right? Or a status quo that we could make better. Like, we could have it so much better, and healthcare is an example of that. And making that connection, to me, is probably central to the task, and is one that creative people really, I hope, take on.
Here's a good one. This person asks or says this: I'm an activist for things big and small. So far, so good. However, people with opposite values are doing the same thing and winning. How can you convince me not to give up? Somebody asked this question. It's a
Right.
good one. I think I've given up myself.
I don't believe you. I don't think you've given up. I think if you're here, you haven't given up, right? But I know it's hard, and I'm often overwhelmed, and I think anybody who has dedicated lots of time to trying to pursue justice in one way or another just feel defeated a lot of the time. And so there's a real interesting conversation going on, I think, amongst activist circles about avoiding burnout and being in for the long haul. I guess I would say one thing, and this is a chapter from the book, is that it is very tempting to allow our minds to be swamped with images of total victory. Like we're gonna have the rebellion, the revolution, whatever, and that's gonna fix all the problems, and we're gonna win, and we're gonna get the right president in, and we're gonna sign the right legislation, and then it's good. And again, what all of the people who study legislative success and climate policy and democratic governance find is that the crucial work is what happens after the victory, right? You get everyone out to the protest, and then what happens next, right? Does the law get implemented well? Or do people just go home and then let kind of lobbyists take over the details? And so I think one way to try to avoid burnout is to find ways to enjoy the unsexy, day-to-day, banal work of not just creating social change, but making it stick. And what's going to do that is doing it in community, doing exactly what you are all doing by coming here today, right? Finding people that we feel solidarity with, that we feel a sense of responsibility to, so that we stick around over time and not just for the sort of most exciting moments of the fight.
Thank you. Here is I think, a complimentary question. Comment on the state of helplessness operant today due to the tendency for, we'll just say, some people to ignore all the rules. And a follow-on part, how do we inspire young people against this backdrop of not following rules?
I suppose it depends on which rules. Maybe I want to challenge the premise of the question a little bit. So earlier this year, I wrote an op-ed called "The Golden Age of Protest is Now." And I was drawing on really terrific research from a person named Erica Chenoweth, who studies social movements. And what Chenoweth finds is that never before in American history have there been as widespread protests as there have been in the last 4 years. In more places across the country, people are standing up and challenging what's happening than happened in the 2016 era, than happened in the civil rights movement, and happened in the environmental movement. We've had, aside from the first Earth Day, the biggest single-day protest in American history in recent years. And so I think there's sort of a misperception that everyone's just sitting on their hands. And in some ways, that's an informational problem. It's a news media problem. But it's actually not true. And maybe it's born of that same desire to kind of see everyone rise up all at once. But I actually, like, as someone who teaches young people in college, I see a real fire amongst them to try to make the world a better place and to be willing to stick their necks out to do it. And so I'm, I guess, a little less despairing than the framing of the question made it sound.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more, and this is a simple one. What role in social change does one-on-one dialogue play?
Yeah, a huge role, right? I mean, so if anyone has followed the discussion about deep canvassing, if you've gone out to try to do get out the vote work, that's a sort of prime example of the value of one-on-one conversation. So deep canvassing is when instead of just like knocking on someone's door and say, are you going to vote? Great, check the box and then leave. You try to connect with people, right? You talk about why the issues matter to you, how the issues have affected your life, and then elicit from them what they care about. And you listen and you have a human conversation. Deep canvassing has been shown to be far more effective than forms that don't really pursue the time and the connection of one-on-one conversation. So I'm all for it. And I suppose one way of just connecting it back to the theme of the talk is that, if again you think of this either-or structural individual pendulum, I think the mistake is to think that, well, if we've got to take down the fossil fuel industry or change the Supreme Court or whatever the massive structural changes, that leaves out some story of what each of us do as individuals. One-on-one conversations is one of the most powerful things that we can do as individuals to enact that sort of peer influence. I rushed through a little bit at the end, apologies for that. But what do we have the conversation about? What do we use peer influence for, right? It can be more or less significant things, and that's where I would sort of invite you to turn that conversation to what you think the real sources of our problems are and the real solutions to them.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for sharing your expertise with us. These are good questions that I didn't get to. Maybe I'll give them to you to consider for your next book. And we hope all of you enjoyed today's presentation at the Lyceum. Thanks for coming, and thank you for your support for this 2026 season. Please join us next week, and this is sort of related to some of these questions. Maybe you want to come and visit us next week for this. We actually have 3 high school students who are going to speak to the audience about what it's like in 2026 and trying to navigate this mess that we have and the social problems. So that'll be next week. So now, finally, you can join us for refreshments and conversations. Maybe you can answer some of those questions right behind us through this door for refreshments. So let's give it up for Michael one last time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.